The following is intended as a work of critical analysis. It is not intended to be viewed by anyone who has not seen The Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya, nor is it intended for anyone who has not seen the previous two parts of the series. It is also not intended as a work of piracy, and it is covered under fair use as a transformative critical work. The morning of December the 19th opens much the same way as the previous 3 days. In fact, exactly the same way. Here's a composite shot of all 4 openings. Aside from minor things that you would have to look very hard to notice, like the organization of the clothes and the fact that Shamisen missing in one of them, the glaringly apparent thing is that the beam of light was only missing on the previous day and has since returned to crossing Kyon's body. Now, in the first 2 parts of the series, I acknowledged that as Haruhi, and we may have to revise this theory. Haruhi Suzumiya does not appear on December 19th at all. For that reason, we can't really make a one-to-one correlation between this beam of light and Haruhi. Now, Haruhi certainly does represent light in the film. We've seen before the glow that comes off of her when she enters the scene, the bold colors that she infuses into the film. But there's simply no way to associate this beam of light with Haruhi any longer. Now, as far as I can see, there are 2 possible ways to take this beam of light. The first and strongest reading, I would say, would be that Nagato is associated with the beam of light now. We've seen her in the same framing that we've seen Haruhi being represented by light, the softer, more diffused light that we saw in the previous scene as Kyon opened the door. We also know now that this is a world where Nagato has replaced Haruhi. So in a sense, it would seem that she has replaced Haruhi as the light in Kyon's life, even though he hasn't quite accepted that yet. Now, there are a few problems that I see with this interpretation. First, the light is not any more diffused or softer than it was in previous versions. If we have that type of light representing Yuki, we would expect this light to be similar to the light that we saw coming out of the club room when Yuki was the only person in it. Secondly, there would be no reason why the light would be missing from December the 18th. After all, Yuki still was in that world. Unfortunately, the other possible reading has a number of issues with it as well. We can see this light then as a representation of Haruhi, as we established earlier, and simply acknowledging the fact that Yuki changed her world to include Haruhi in it as soon as Kyon mentioned how much he valued his experiences with the SOS Brigade. By this interpretation, Haruhi did not exist at all on the date of December the 18th, and that's the reason the beam of light was missing from the opening sequence on that date. The only problem I see with this interpretation is that we talked a lot about the light from outside in the city representing Haruhi in Kyon's scene with Asakura in the classroom. If Haruhi didn't exist at that time period, then there would be no connection there in that visual symbolism. That said, I would take this as the preferred reading and change our previous reading of the Asakura scene to simply be the second thing we talked about the stark black and white contrast. The light from outside in the city in those scenes doesn't really add any color to the film like we saw associated with Haruhi, instead only adds a brightness, and could be implied by Kyon speaking of her in that way. Anywho, let's continue on with the film. The first thing we'll notice is some very short connecting shots that we've only seen in Yuki's world, whereas everything in Haruhi's was focused on the characters and their interactions. The movie in Yuki's world takes time to set up these small little things, like the entrance to the school and students walking in the hallway. The next shot is kind of a jarring one. The camera pans up over the classroom with a number of CGI desks over hand-drawn characters. finally setting on the back of Asakura's head. Not only is it very odd from a camera movement perspective, just simply as something that you never really see because it's almost impossible to do with hand-drawn animation, it's also not that symbolic, I would say. Nobody sits behind Asakura, and the desk we start on isn't particularly relevant at all. I suppose we could connect it back to Yuki's world emphasizing the minor characters and the settings as we've seen before, but I think the closest point of reference here would be the opening of Hibike Euphonium, actually. A series that Kyon would do much, much, much later in their lifespan, but would be lauded for the same type of production values and high-quality animation that is present in this movie. Hibike Euphonium features a very distinctive and very similar shot in its opening sequence, again using computer-generated animation in order to make a classroom seem expansive or get a shot that wouldn't be possible with normal animation. All of that is to say that I'm not quite sure KyoAni's doing anything except experimenting here. That's not to discount Kyon's wonderful line here, "The cold has spread all over the school," which really sets the tone very nicely for the rest of the day. A few things about Kyon's interaction with Asakura. First, he's no longer on edge. He has resigned himself to the fact that the world is different, and there's no reason to be upset about something he can't change. And secondly, her line about having to accept things that are right in front of you. We know from the end of the film that Asakura is fully aware of the situation. While the verdict for Yuki is still out, we certainly can say that Asakura knows the world was changed and is on a mission to protect Yuki's new world. That makes Kyon's first line here pretty comedic, among other things, but also evidence that Asakura is different in her mission than she was when we last saw her in The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, if not so much different in her methods of execution. And that's a pretty funny pun. This could mean, most likely, that Asakura was created by Yuki to help fulfill her goal of establishing this new world and being the force for her selfish desires that Yuki never could. One of the comments on the last video was pointing out how expressive the characters are in this film, and I certainly think it's a credit to KyoAni's production values here, but Asakura's nod after telling Kyon to go to the hospital is absolutely wonderful. So the next 3 minutes or so of the film is dedicated to Kyon expositing exactly what's going on. It does catch us up on the events if anyone was lost, but it also provides us with an idea, finally, of what the show's trying to do, or what this movie's actually about. Up until now, we haven't really had any direction for the scale or the scope of what's going to occur, what the movie is trying to get at. Kyon here finally makes it apparent to the viewer what the main decision is. It's the main decision he's struggling with, and it's the one that we want to see resolved over the course of the film. However, I feel it's a little bit dishonest coming from Kyon. That is, he's already made this decision. He simply doesn't know it yet. The movie's about him realizing and accepting the fact of a decision that he's already made. Remember here, we talked about the onus of the viewer onto Kyon, that having seen the previous world along with him, we innately want him to return to that world as well. And then we have everything that the movie's done so far to persuade us that Haruhi's world was somehow better. All the laughter and all the emotion and character moments that we saw previous to her disappearance are all gone now. So us having known that as valid and as something that's desirable, not only for Kyon, but also for our entertainment as viewers, we have already made the decision, along with Kyon, that we want to return to the misadventures of Haruhi and Kyon. I brought up this point once in a discussion on Reddit, and I had somebody contest that and say that they primarily wanted Yuki to succeed, or Yuki to be appreciated. Now, I would say those things are not mutually exclusive, and that's the fallacy that Yuki has established by creating this new world. That she wants to be noticed and appreciated in the same way that Haruhi does, so she removed everything else that impedes that. She sees Haruhi as probably rightly so, as an overwhelming force that's blinding Kyon from accepting Yuki as well. What this movie shows by the ending is that they can still have that world with Haruhi and the adventures and the color and the laughter, and Kyon can also appreciate Yuki for who she is. So that established, this monologue is really misguided from Kyon. This is not what the movie's going to be about, him realizing whether or not he enjoyed Haruhi. He already knows he enjoyed Haruhi, just from everything we've seen presented in the film. We know what he's going to choose. He has to, there's no movie otherwise. So while this monologue may point the first-time viewer down the direction of the mystery, by the end of the film, or for a second or third or fourth time viewing this film, it should become apparent that the true question isn't who changed the world, but why did she change the world? Now all this takes place over a montage of Kyon noticing little things about the new world in general, stuff that he would never have noticed with Haruhi in the film. He finds a bagworm cocoon on a piece of an umbrella and moves it to a nearby tree. He notices some students planting bulbs outside the classroom, all images invoking some sort of dormant life that is about to awaken, and I don't think there's any other reading than the dormant Yuki, who is about to awaken once noticed by Kyon and appreciated by Kyon. Also notice a lot of these shots are framed in a way that puts Kyon in the background or pulls the world out front. A couple shots in particular I want to point out. The bare face with the word love written in it, reflected in a window, where two girls giggle and share a happy moment together, we only see their reflections. This happens 2 other times in this very montage, and is further reinforcement that the world hidden behind the window or the mirror is the one with the happiness and the joy in it. I specifically like the bit where Kyon pulls out the invitation to join the literary club as he bumps into Mikuru, because Mikuru has the appropriate response to the person Kyon was yesterday. She is absolutely put off by him and does not want anything to do with him. And it should come as a surprise then that Yuki was so invested in establishing some sort of relationship with Kyon. Just some further evidence that Yuki is entirely aware of what she's doing to the world. So Kyon enters the club room once again, and this time we're not greeted with any soft light pouring out or anything like that. Only a minor change to the coloration of the film. While it was desaturated up until this point today, we have a little more skin tone, a little more vibrancy in things. Wow, so do you know what this scene is? This scene is when Kyon finally gets to learn who Yuki is, or at least starts to. Look at the way this shot is composed. There is nothing between their line of sight. It goes straight from her eyes to his. And that's not something that we've seen until this point. than anyone other than Haruhi and Kyon. Even Taniguchi and Kunakita were drawn with profile shots so that their eyes were always cut by the frame. So maybe on your first go-through of this movie you think, oh, this is a trash line, what are these cuts here on the chair and the printer? And oh god, this movie is so slow, get to the mystery, we have to find out who did change the world. But then you realize this is the most important scene in the entire film. And you know what? I don't think Kyon ever gets there. He never arrives at a place where he can realize what's important before the movie ends, and that's what the final scene's about. So in this scene here, if he would have understood what the objective was and what he needed to do, he could have saved himself a whole mess of trouble. But Kyon's never been the brightest person. And that's sort of why we love him. Part of his appeal is he is an everyman, and he's stupid, makes mistakes, and generally misses things. And to be honest, I doubt many of us could have fared much better than him in this situation. Instead of, oh man, find what's going on, go look for Haruhi. I'm yelling at Kyon now, ask her what her book's about, get to know her better. And he very nearly almost does, with his line about, have you ever written a book? We can certainly see this entire affair as Yuki's book. For these next few shots, I just want to appreciate how well the drama is conveyed without any line being said. The hesitation on the pickup, the shaking of his hand, his expression after he reads the note. And here when Kyon confronts Yuki, he turns away from her in this world into the reflection in the window.
Fine. I'd be more worried if you did write it. Sorry.
Just again with the power of the emotions, we, with Kyon, are relieved that he's not crazy, that we're not crazy, and that we've been vindicated by that note.
Nagato. Does this mean 2 days from today?
So Kyon spends the next few minutes with his kind of ridiculous logical rambling, going through and violating all of Yuki's valued possessions, just really showing how he still doesn't get it. But I'd like to take this time to talk about Hyperion. If you haven't read the sci-fi novel Hyperion, and you'd like to understand the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya better, it's a great place to start. It is a novel precisely about the type of world that Haruhi wishes to live in. It's also in the original light novels of the Haruhi Suzumiya franchise, mentioned by name. So it's clear that the original author, when he constructed the story of Haruhi Suzumiya, had not only read the book, but also considered it relevant and important to who the characters are. There are also one-to-one correlations between some of the characters in the novel and the characters in the Haruhi franchise, such as the Technocore and the Data Integration Thought Entity. And finally, there's the same type of spirit that Haruhi embodied in the work of Hyperion itself, specifically in the very famous last scene where the pilgrims march off to the time tombs with much the same attitude that Haruhi approaches all of life. So Kyon obviously runs up against a brick wall and has a wonderful line where he says, I guess she's not used to having people notice her. Then he's finally back on track for what actually matters. Unfortunately, he still confuses that with rejecting Haruhi. I know we mentioned it earlier, but the little minute motions and animations in the film, the fact that Kyon's jacket rustles, and when he asks Nagato if she was waiting for him, she flinches in a way that can only be described as moe. And it just makes the emotions the characters are experiencing feel so tangible, really jump off the screen. The next scene has Kyon go a bit farther with his realization here. He has never walked Nagato home. Why is that? He doesn't rightly know. And why, now that he's doing it, does his lack of it feel wrong to him? I think we also need to mention the light in this scene and perhaps revise our theory about what light means for the film. Now, there are these brief flashes back and forth of the cars going by on the highway. What's very apparent to me is that Yuki does not generate light in the same way that Haruhi does. Instead, her representations of being associated with light have been somewhat more of a mimicry or an affectation towards it. These flashes of light back and forth while the characters are mostly surrounded in darkness, and the flashes of character building as the characters are mostly separate, leads me to associate light instead with an emotional bond or a mutual appreciation or respect and admiration or understanding. That is to say, Kyon already has that type of relationship with Haruhi. He's established that, and you can see it manifest in Someday in the Rain. However, he does not have any type of relationship with Nagato, and as he builds it, he brings more and more light and more understanding into the movie. I think that's really well manifest in this shot of Yuki turning on the lights in her apartment. There's nothing here that's gonna help Kyon find Haruhi faster. Instead, what he's doing is establishing the relationship, and that in and of itself generates the light. Perhaps we could also connect it to the idea of heat as well with the tokusatsu. So Yuki's line here about her memory of the library is extremely important. Not only does it kind of tell us that she does in fact remember something that happened from the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, but she remembers the one thing that was an intimate relationship between her and Kyon, or actually the foundation of a friendship there. The one moment of understanding and empathy that Kyon, mistakenly almost, did for Yuki was the one thing that she retained when she remade the world. This is a huge sign to Kyon about what's really important here. Of course, it's a very hard one to read, but what follows is a very lovely flashback sequence. Of course, with some of the events changed to write Haruhi out. And it's really the basis for the interpretation that I see a lot from this film, that it's about extreme introversion or even autism. And perhaps that is true, but I think this story is mostly about the value of understanding other people, and the idea was to set up a foil to Haruhi's extreme extroversion. And because the true feelings have been shared and the characters have opened up to one another, both Kyon and the viewer are rewarded with extreme light, extreme clarity, and extreme production values on Nagato's glance up at Kyon. Now, this is a bit of a digression, and I do hate to bring in extra textual references, but this scene can't help but remind me of the budget smile scene, once again from Hibike Euphonium. The same exact thing happens. When Kumiko opens up to Rika and vice versa, the viewers and Kumiko are treated to an immense reward of the character being portrayed beautifully and in wonderful light for all that she is. Kyon is visibly taken aback by that. But as we can see by his next line, he still doesn't quite understand. And he doesn't quite respond appropriately. So the camera pans out. It moves away from the characters. And it doesn't show us their faces any longer. There's a quick 1-2 punch here. It's first the hot pot, then Kyon looking left, then Asakura looking right. Then the two of them together with a hot pot between them. In this scene, there's nothing between them. They're not split off by this scene, so they're forced to interact on that type of level. They're repeatedly shown within the same frame, and there's only the black bar of the window behind them that would even really separate them. So their dialogue here is very surprisingly intimate. That type of intimacy that Asakura and Kyon are awkwardly sharing right now is exactly what Yuki is looking for. While Kyon has absolutely no intention of sharing it with someone he still remembers as a murderer, the money shot for the scene shows that he, while a complete idiot most of the time, is not at all heartless, and he won't deny that to Yuki. And I'll just say it one more time, but I don't think this film works at all without these subtle emotions coming through in the animation.
Gates of hell.
This entire scene is very, very bright, but Kyon is not shown to connect to Yuki any further over dinner. The only real moment is when he requests to come back to the literature club room tomorrow, and the reaction on Yuki, once again a huge payoff for the viewer and for Kyon, but also shown in the brightest light possible. Kyon's face is almost completely oversaturated by the color that he's just released from the relationship with Yuki. And once again, that's not because he decided to choose Yuki over Haruhi, but that she has an opportunity to get to know him better, or that he has an opportunity to get to know her. Kyon is understandably still reeling from what all of this means in the next scene with Asakura. There's a very nice directing trick of the in media res, with Asakura saying that she's been talking to him the entire time. But I think what's really important is the undertone in Asakura's message to Kyon. First is the suggestion of a romantic relationship between the two, which was not even insinuated up until this point. The second is her reference to liking even weirder girls than her. That, along with Yuki talking about the events that did occur in the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, really confuses Kyon, as it should. If the world was completely changed, those two things would not happen. Also, when she threatens Kyon and warns him against breaking Yuki's heart, she has a line about why she would do that. While we established that Yuki is the primary foil for Haruhi, what I think is also important is seeing Asakura in the same type of mold of Haruhi, as someone who gets things done, as an active participant on the world where Yuki has been entirely passive up until this movie. Asakura is the part of Yuki that would use force to achieve her ends. And that part of Asakura has not changed at all. It's actually a very nice setup for when she does get violent at the end of the film. And the final shot for this portion of the film is powerful on multiple levels. First, a tonal readjustment. After all that character building between Yuki and Kyon, we have Kyon completely entranced once again by Haruhi. This puts the focus of the viewer back on the problem at hand. That's very important as we hadn't seen Haruhi at all for the past day, and we really need the viewer's focus to be on the ostensible main objective of the film. However, I love the visual imagery here. Kyon, while walking through the darkness, very apparent that he does not generate light, literally says a prayer to Haruhi. He invokes her into the world and is granted some light. And where he stops on his walk is under that light. We've established that the interpersonal relationships generate light. And Kyon invoking that strong relationship he shares with Haruhi was enough to grant him a little direction and a little light in his darkest hour.
Why me?
Stay tuned for the next episode where we learn how very wrong we already are about the little beam of light across Kyon's bed.